So the topic today is open source licenses. And since this is going to be a legal presentation, I have to give you the standard Bar Association disclaimer. So bear with me. This is a topic on the law and it may cause drowsiness. So don't operate a motor vehicle or any heavy equipment during this presentation. Also, this is a presentation that offers legal information, not legal advice. So if you have a particular legal situation, you should consult a legal professional on your specific facts that pertain to you. Don't take this as any kind of legal advice. So with that out of the way, I want to tell you guys about a few years ago, a client came to my office looking for me to respond to a cease and desist letter from another law firm. So a cease and desist letter, if you don't know, is basically a lawyer's way of saying, knock it off or I'm going to sue you. So if you ever get a cease and desist letter from a law firm, don't ignore it. This particular cease and desist letter said, stop copying my client's code. And it was a little unusual because of two reasons. First, the letter wasn't addressed to my client. It was addressed to an open source project. And second, the letter was written on behalf of another open source project. So let's set the scene here. We have one open source project, let's call them Project Left, hired a law firm to send a cease and desist letter to another open source project, let's call them Project Right. And my client was not named in the letter, but was giving me a bag of money to send a response to the cease and desist letter. So you might first be wondering, why would someone hire a lawyer to respond to a cease and desist letter that they weren't addressed to? Well, in this case, the client was a sponsor of Project Right's project. So they were giving them money to create the project. My client was using their code in their software product. So they had a commercial interest in making sure that Project Right survived this legal challenge. You might also be wondering, why would one open source project care if another open source project used their code? I mean, they're both open source projects. So the reason was that Project Left was licensed under the GNU General Public license, which is everybody knows as GPL. And Project Right was licensed under the MIT license. And to understand why this mattered, I want to take you with me on a copyright journey full of action, mystery, and if we're lucky, some romance. So copyright law is actually talked about in the US Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 says that Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. Basically what that means is we as a society want to have some kind of bargain with creators. You add to our body of knowledge, and in return we'll give you a monopoly right over your work for a period of time. And in the US and many other countries, a copyright is what you get for creative works. And a copyright happens automatically. So whenever you fix your creative work on some kind of tangible medium, you automatically get a copyright whether you ask for it or not. And a copyright is actually a bundle of rights. You have the right to reproduce your work, to modify your work, to distribute copies of it, and to display it publicly. And believe it or not, computer code is considered a creative work worthy of copyrights, even back-end code. That was a little back-end dig that I wasn't sure I was going to put in, but I figured, why not? Sorry, Keegan. So we have copyright. You can get a copyright for source code and object code. And a copyright license is a contract that permits non-owners of a copyright work to be able to modify, distribute, copy the work under certain conditions. So if you're the owner of a copyright, you give somebody a license to that copyright, they can go do things with that work under certain conditions. And we're all familiar of the proprietary license. This is really a way to clamp down on access to the source code and restrict how people use it. Usually you don't even get the source code. You get like the object code or a minified code, and they don't want users to see how their secret sauce, their source code. Typically these proprietary licenses restrict republishing of the software, like copies of the software. They don't allow you to modify their software. They usually restrict the number of installs, the number of users. They often restrict any kind of liability that their software, if you lose any data because of their software, they don't want to be liable for that. Some licenses will only give you license to use their code for personal use and not commercial use. There's all kinds of restrictions that you get with proprietary software licenses. So a lot of developers thought that, hey, the copyright law doesn't strike the right balance between owners of software and the rights of software users. They said, hey, software is utilitarian in nature, not expressive. You know, developers that hide their software don't give society the benefit of promoting science and useful arts, like in the Constitution. They hide their knowledge. So these rebels stood up on their workstation, held up their Jolt Cola high in the air, and they screamed revolution. And they hacked the copyright system, just like good coders should. They created open source licenses that gave users the freedom to use, modify, publish the software, and more importantly, they required that the public have access to their modified source code. So there's a big, broad spectrum of different open source licenses. Some simply just require that you release the code without restrictions, and there's some that are more protective, and they try to maximize the rights access to the source code. So there's everything in between. And in this presentation, I want to go through some of the different open source licenses that exist. So a protective open source license, sometimes known as a copyright license, a copyleft license, sorry, or a restrictive license, requires a reciprocal licensing of the modified source code. The most popular type of protective license is the GPL license, which is the GNU's General Public License. This is for that cease and desist letter. This was the type of license that the Project Right was sending to stop copying of their code. So a protective license gives you the freedom to use, publish, sell, and modify their software under certain conditions. If you don't meet those conditions that I'm going to tell you about, then that license is automatically revoked, or there's sometimes a cure period that you can fix whatever you're doing so that you can get back the license. Now, one of those conditions are that anytime you release software under this protective license, either the original or the modified software, you have to give that software the same license as the original. So if you have a GPL licensed software, if you modify that software and release it, then that release code also has to fall under the GPL license. You can't make it a proprietary license. And the license defines release as like distributing the software outside of the company. So an employee to employee distribution within a company does not qualify as a release. You can keep, you don't have to publish the source code in that case. And even if you're hired to, as an outside consultant, to modify a private copy of a company's code that was open source, that does not count as a release. So private copies that are modified, even outside a company, that doesn't qualify as a release. It's what we would think of as a release, like public access outside of the company. And if you do release the software, you have to provide the source code. This is like kind of the bedrock philosophy of open source. You know, you shouldn't be able to hide your source code if you benefit from open source. So some of these open source licenses also say that you can't sue someone for circumventing your digital rights management that you put into the code. So you can take open source code, you can add DRM to it, but you're not allowed to sue someone from hacking your DRM. This is the whole freedom to use philosophy of code. And yeah,
ask a question, or are we?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm bad about looking at the chat, so if you want to ask.
No worries. If you include copyleft code, like GPL code, and a project that you want to kind of close source or at least release under a different license, does that mean like the entire project has to be copyleft, or just that feature? Or like, is there a way to kind of like separate the copyleft code from the rest of the application?
A true copyleft code, you would have to open source your entire project. They consider once you like bring in some copyleft code, then you've modified your code and it's considered like now open source.
Okay.
But there's other licenses that we'll talk about that don't require that. Okay.
Second question. I heard like way back in the day that Microsoft ripped off a lot of Linux code and closed sourced it and then lied about it. Like, did that happen, or like would people know if that happened, or like?
I don't know.
Okay. Like, I know they were like in court forever, and it was like a huge thing, especially in the you know, beginnings of Microsoft. So yeah, those are my questions. So.
Okay. Yeah, ask away if you have any more. So the other point I wanted to make about open source licenses is trademarks are fine. So like Debian and Ubuntu, those are trademarked open source distros, and that's totally cool. You can open source. You can take open source code, brand it under your trademark, release it to the public, and you can sue someone for trademark infringement if they start using your trademark in their code. So even with Debian's code, you can take Debian source code, release it, but you can't call it Debian. All right, so now that we talked about protective copyleft code, I want to point out that, so remember we said distributing means going outside of your company? Well, there's this SaaS loophole. So a company that takes open source code, turns it into a web app or a SaaS service, doesn't have to release their software because it never leaves their company. They just keep it in-house. And so they don't have to open source or release their code to the public if it's a network service. So for a company like MongoDB that is a database network service, it doesn't make sense for them to release their code under an open source license and then have somebody take that source code, create a competing service and never release it. So they came up with this other more protective open source license called Network Protective License. And that defines, it requires you to open source your code if your code is used over a network, not just releasing it. But once you offer some kind of network service then you're required to open source your code if it's based on another network protected license. So these open source licenses, they corrected a lot of problems that open source advocates perceived that, software was now free to run, to copy, to distribute, to study, change, and you were able to improve the software by looking at the source code. The only problem was that some people thought these libraries went too far. The source code went too far, and it kept people from using open source libraries. So, like someone said, if I take an open source library and I want to put it into my proprietary source code, now I have to release my source code. People were reluctant to use open source libraries. And that created opportunities for proprietary software licenses, proprietary software libraries to become the industry standard because people didn't want to use the open source libraries. So to address that, we came up with these weakly protective licenses. And weakly protective licenses said that you can have proprietary software coexist with open source libraries. And the way they distinguish between whether you have to open source your code or not is they said if your code only uses a library, uses in quotes, then it can remain proprietary. But if your code is based on a library, then it must have the same license as the library. So if your code modifies the open source library, then it's considered based on the library, and you have to open source your library. You can't keep it proprietary. Code that dynamically links to a library is considered using it, and it can stay proprietary. Now you have a situation with statically linked libraries. They may fall under the based on definition, and they have to be open sourced. If you have a code bundler like Webpack, then you may have to bundle your open source JavaScript libraries separate from your proprietary code, and then call those libraries with a link to those libraries. But then again, there are some exceptions, and you know what? Nobody wants to deal with that. Lots of developers weren't that interested in figuring out if their code was going to be using a license or based on an open source library. They weren't that interested in the strict doctrines of the open source philosophy. They just wanted people to get the maximum benefit from their software. So permissive licenses to the rescue. So basically all they say is do whatever you want with the code. Just, maybe keep a copyright notice in the code. You don't have to have some kind of reciprocal open source license with our code. You can keep it, you can modify it, you can even sell it without giving anything back to the developers. They didn't require a whole lot. Now, these open source permissive licenses, like you see all these projects here that are listed under that, they don't really, I don't think they fully embrace the noble goals of open source philosophies of those protective licenses. They don't require you to share your improvements with the community. You can still do that, but there's no legal obligation to do that under these permissive licenses. But they do make adoption a lot easier, open source adoption a lot easier. They don't typically conflict with those protective licenses and even the proprietary licenses. You can put them in both. They're also more likely to be commercially sponsored. If you're a commercial company, you get the double benefit when you sponsor an open source project of creating goodwill by helping produce something for the common good, and you get to retain the ability to put that open source code into your proprietary products. So let's just talk a little bit about some other terms that may be in open source licenses that are common different types of licenses, whether they're permissive or restrictive. So many open source licenses, like proprietary licenses, disclaim any kind of warranties, liability for damages. They don't guarantee any kind of support for their code. And that's just a very good idea to have in your code. Some of them require that any contributor that contributes to the open source project has to also license any patents that they own that might infringe on that software. And some of them also contain a patent retaliation clause, where if you institute some kind of patent litigation against anyone that uses the open source software, that automatically causes the open source license to be revoked for you. Some licenses require that you credit the original author, and some of them prohibit the original authors from being named to endorse or promote your modified code. So if we go back to our spectrum of different open source licenses, we can view them more generally now. And a lot of them have a common requirement that you have attribution and a license notice. A lot of them require that, a lot of them say that they don't, they disclaim any damages. So that's common to everyone. On the right side are the permissive licenses, and those are the ones that allow you to modify code and keep it proprietary or closed source. So those are very, very hands-off approach to software. There's no reciprocal license that's required. On the left side are the protective licenses. Those require the reciprocal licensing for modifications. If you modify source code under a protective license, your modification is also required to be licensed under a protective license, and you have to make the source code available to users. Then we have the weakly protective licenses. Those are the ones that exempt proprietary code that merely uses open source libraries, and we have the strongly protective licenses at the far end of the left side, and those require open source code. They require you to open source your code if it's used over a computer network. So if you base your code over another open source network license, then you have to have that reciprocal license whenever you give users the ability to use your code over a network. Now, there's no correct open source license to use. These different licenses reflect different philosophies about the public's right to access the code. There's different views about developers' ability to keep code proprietary. There's different goals about code adoption. But what's important is that you actually license your code under one of these licenses if that's your intent. Remember, the default rule is that you can't copy or modify software without permission from the copyright holder. So if you went on GitHub and you found some code that you wanted to use, but there was no license specified, then you don't want to run the risk of putting that code in your project and possibly get sued for copyright infringement. So software without a license is closed source software. So here's just a glimpse of the top, I think it's 8 of the most popular open source licenses in 2019. And the first 3 there listed are the permissive licenses that you can keep closed source if you wanted to. And those account for more than half of the licenses, open source licenses. And so there's this growing trend towards permissive licenses. It didn't always used to be that way. It used to be that protective licenses were the majority of licenses. But I think that's probably due to software companies kind of embracing this open source model for code development where they sponsor the code and use it. Now, one other big topic that I want to talk about with open source is license compatibility. And this means that can you use one open source license in conjunction with another open source license? So in this diagram here, anytime you go from one open source box to another open source box, if there's an arrow leading to it, then they are compatible licenses. They don't have any terms that conflict. So for example, Apache 2.0 licensed code can be subsequently licensed or combined with code that's GPL v3 license. So you see like the arrow leading from Apache going to LGPL3, that's the loosely permissive license. And then it goes to the GPL v3. So that's permissible because there's arrows that lead to that path. But you can't take your Apache 2.0 code and release it or combine it with GPL v2 code. There's no arrow that gives you that path leading to it. And that's probably due to some conflict in the code terms, like maybe one requires some type of patent release and the other one has a different type of patent release, and they can't coexist. So, and the other thing is you can't go backwards. So you can't go from a strongly protective license to a permissive license. The flow is only from permissive to protective. So you can't release GPL code under an MIT license. If you wanted to maintain your product's license, then first don't use proprietary code. If your project is proprietary, then generally you can use permissive licenses, but not protective licenses or copyleft licenses. If you want to maintain your project as under a protective license, then in general you can use both permissive and protective licensed code in your project. And if you have a project that you want to maintain as a permissive license, then in general you can use other permissive licenses, but you can't use those more protective licensed code in your project. So basically, permissive licenses are the universal donor of the software world.
Where are the lines drawn? Like, is it like line by line? Like, can you say like no line?
No, you really have to dig into the code. But I mean, all this information is available on the internet. But it's really just the terms of when these licenses were drafted. Like, are there conflicts in them? And it's hard to know.
I get vaguely the kind of the spirit of the license, but it's the code parts that aren't clear, because you mentioned that like different libraries can be licensed differently, and then you can have different licenses within the same project. I was just kind of wondering, is it like line by line, or is it like feature by feature? Is it like function by function, or is it like
well, I mean, it's anytime there's some copyrighted material that comes in. So if you're if you're updating your source code, and let's say a contributor is updating their source code, then they need to license their contribution under the same permissive license. You can't have, or even if you're trying to like bring in some source code file from let's say you have a permissive project, right? You have an MIT licensed project, and you see, oh, there's some software under this GPL licensed project that would be perfect in my project. Well, as soon as you put that source code, that file in your project, because the GPL requires you to open source your project and any modifications thereof, now you've turned your permissive project into a GPL project. Does that make sense?
Kind of, but like do they have to be in the same file, or like it's I think I should probably like kind of drill down. I've never been good at remembering the license.
Well, it's anytime you're adding basically copyrightable material. You're saying you can, if it's something trivial like "Hello World," then that's not, copyrighted
Well, it just
contribution.
threw me for a loop because you said like the licensing is different if it's a library. So like if I
Oh,
run
right.
it if I run a some code as like an application, I can it's one license, but if I import it into another, like even if the file I imported to is blank except for importing and running the library, it's like a whole different license. I've never heard that before, so that was
Yeah. So those are, yeah, that's a completely different type of license. And they make exceptions to libraries that are dynamically linked, or they're used but not based on, and
okay.
that's just a separate license. But some open source licenses don't even give you that assurance. Like the GPL v3 license, or all the GPL licenses, that not the LGPL.
Okay.
So that those, even if you use their library, you have to open source your code.
So here's the thought experiment. So say you have a project and you are writing it under the MIT license, and you get a dependency, like a single dependency, and that dependency is under GPL. Does that mean your whole project now has to be under GPL?
Yeah, that's a big problem. There's some libraries out there that say they're MIT, but they have dependencies that are GPL. And they're, if you audit those dependencies, you'll see that they are not really, MIT licensed software. And there's actually industries that are created over auditing code to make sure that your proprietary licensed code is actually proprietary. You may think that they are because you added in some MIT licensed code into it, but that MIT licensed code has more dependencies that are not MIT code.
Okay, hey guys, I want to do a quick time check. We're at 30 minutes now.
Okay, I'm almost done.
And so I'm just going to ask everybody to hold the rest of their questions till the end, please.
Okay. So let's see. That brings us back to our cease and desist letter. So if you recall, we have project left that is under a GPL license, and it's a protective license where you have to give a reciprocal license to any modified code. And then we have project right, which is under the MIT permissive license. So project left was basically saying, hey, project right, you're relicensing our GPL code as MIT license code. Someone could take project left's code, modify it, and keep it proprietary, which is not project left's intention. So we looked into it, and there were 3 reasons why project right had similar code as project left. First, they were using some files that contain source code from a third-party library that was common to both projects, and that was okay. Second, some files had a common contributor to both projects, and that contributor licensed her code under their respective licenses. So that was okay. But the most satisfying reason why they had the similarity in code was that some of the code that project left had was actually copied from project right, and we found that out by looking at the dates on the copyrights and when they were released on GitHub. So we pointed out to project left that they have to update their license credits to give project right license. So we sent out that response letter, and we never heard back from project left. And that's it. That's the end of my talk. Here's my contact info again. I'm also on LinkedIn. If anybody wants to connect, I'm happy to connect with you guys. And if you want to ask me any questions, I'll be happy to take them.